Ara sí donem pas a la darrera ponència del dia. Per això anirem fins als Estats Units per escoltar la senyora Uglean Jackson, supervisora i gestora de registres del Museu de la Natura de Denver i del Departament d'Arxius Científics. Amb més de 15 anys d'experiència en arxius, ha treballat també per la preservació i emmagatzematge de col·leccions digitals i analògiques. És la presidenta de la secció d'arxius de museus de la Societat d'Arxivers Americans. Tancarà aquesta jornada amb una ponència que parla d'enfortir els arxius dels museus, promoció, col·laboració i nous reptes. Senyora Uglean, bon dia.
Great, thank you so much. Are you sharing my slides or should I?
Sí. Pot començar? Sí, projectaran de seguida el PowerPoint.
Perfect, I see them, thank you. Well, good afternoon, or if you're like me in the United States, good morning. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here in Denver, Colorado. And I got up a little bit earlier than usual so that I could watch some of the last few sessions. And I've really enjoyed hearing from professionals at museums in Catalonia and elsewhere. As someone who is always curious about how museums and archives operate outside of North America, it's been really wonderful to learn about the challenges that you're facing and the projects that you're undertaking. I imagine that many of you share that same curiosity, which is why I'm here to offer insight into the work of museum archivists in the United States. So I am Uglean Jackson, digital archivist at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and chair of the Society of American Archivists Museum Archive section. When FINA invited me to speak at the 10th Conference on Museums, Records Management, and Archives, I was incredibly honored. After nearly 20 years as an archivist, this is my first closing keynote address, and it's a responsibility that I take seriously and with humility. So thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you to FINA and all of the conference organizers for planning this international hybrid conference, which I know is no easy feat. And finally, thank you for providing translations to and from English, because I do not speak a word of Spanish or Catalan except for gracias. So I've structured my, can you please go to the next slide, please? Thank you. I've structured this talk like a trumpet. I'm going to start narrow and expand outward. So first I'll share a bit about my background, my experience, and my current role. And then I'll discuss the SAA Museum Archive section, followed by a broader look at the key issues facing museum archives in the United States. My hope is that this structure highlights the connections between individual work and the profession at large, and leaves you with not only a clearer picture of the museum archives landscape in the US, but also ideas for collaboration, because sharing knowledge is at the heart of what we do in archives. Next slide, please. Thank you. Perfect, that one. My journey. I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself, but I believe it's important for you to understand my perspective, my strengths, my weaknesses, and my personal biases. And while it may seem like I'm just sharing my career path, I promise that the themes in my journey connect directly to larger issues in museum archives and the profession at large. So, like most United States archivists, I earned a master's degree in library and information science. Mine is from Simmons University in Boston, and I received that in 2007. Boston, Massachusetts is a city rich with cultural heritage institutions. And while earning my degree, I gained hands-on experience through part-time jobs and internships at places like an architectural firm, Harvard's Fogg Art Museum, and Tufts University. I graduated just before the 2008 recession, and I really wanted to return to my home state of Colorado, where I had spent most of my life. The job market at the time, it was really, really tough then, and it's actually it's always been difficult. There are far more graduates than jobs here in the US. Some of my classmates struggled for years to find full-time work, and some never did. So I was really fortunate to have real, albeit part-time paraprofessional experience to make my resume stand out, as well as the flexibility to take a job that barely paid above minimum wage. And that job was a 1-year grant-funded position at the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center, or AHC, and it became the launchpad for my career. Although I was not returning to Colorado, Wyoming is a bordering state. So at the AHC, which is a massive archive with 90,000 linear feet or 27,000 meters of materials, my job was to review and deaccession collections that didn't fit the center's collecting scope. And it was an incredible job. Every day I got to go into the basement, which is where the collections were. I opened boxes that hadn't been touched in years and summarized information about the collections, which I then presented to a committee that decided whether or not to keep the collection. This work introduced me to the then emerging practice of archival deaccessioning and helped me establish a name in the field. After that grant year was up, I was hired permanently into a faculty level processing position, and I held that for 7 years. During that time, I worked under Mark Green, who is a key figure in US archives and the co-author of the influential MPLP, or More Product, Less Process paper. His leadership instilled in me the importance of open access, strategic acquisitions, and meticulous documentation. From there, I left Wyoming's cold and wind for California's sun and surf and joined the University of California, Irvine in 2014. Moving from a smaller institution with 13,000 students and dwindling state funding to a powerhouse university system with dedicated archival infrastructure expanded my expertise, especially in digital archives. At UCI, I gained hands-on experience in acquiring, managing, preserving, and providing access to born digital materials. But after 3 years, I was homesick and I wanted again to return to Colorado, even if it meant stepping away from a larger institution. So that decision led me to the University of Northern Colorado. That was a personal choice, really, rather than a strategic career move, but it's one that gave me the opportunity to apply everything I had learned at UW and UCI to an archive that really needed some structure, and in the state that I call home, finally. Although I wasn't the boss, I worked with a very supportive manager to improve access, put archival descriptions online, and implement much needed written procedures. But after 5 years, I was ready to lead. I really wanted to shape an archive, to implement my vision of broad access, strategic planning, and rigorous documentation of policies, procedures, and workflows. And that drive led me to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where I became the first digital archivist with managerial oversight of the archives. My job title was intentional, and it was assigned to reflect the growing importance of electronic records. Next slide, please. So by this point, 15 years into my career, I had ample experience with digital records and was a self-described expert in reappraisal and deaccessioning, in backlog management, and collection development. At the same time, archives in the US were undergoing a shift. The once standard practice of prioritizing unrestricted access was being challenged, particularly in the context of materials by and about historically marginalized communities, such as Indigenous Native American groups. The MPLP, More Product, Less Process, which emphasized broad but minimal description, faced criticism for unintentionally burying records related to non-white, non-male communities, while reinforcing capitalist ideals of quantity over quality. And also community archiving, where communities preserve their own records instead of donating them to institutions, was gaining widespread recognition, which is a shift away from the idea that established institutions were the best place for historical documentation. So after spending most of my career in academic institutions, I've now been at a museum for 2.5 years. And I've been able to set a vision and chart a course to prioritize access. But the changing professional landscape and particularities of my museum's collection have challenged certain responsibilities and tasks that I once thought core to an archivist mission. And that intersection between what's known and what's evolving is exactly what I'm excited to explore with you next by sharing a specific example from my work at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, which I will abbreviate that as DMNS. Next slide, please. So DMNS operates much like other museum archives in the US. We store the historical records of the museum and related scientific collections. We preserve its history in all formats. We have text, images, moving images, born digital records, and this history includes scientific explorations, archaeological and paleontological excavations, and cultural research conducted by our curators and staff. Our archives also holds records detailing the museum's 102-year-old building history, which includes 9 major expansions. And we record the history of past exhibitions, as well as staff and administrative history. While these topics are pretty common across institutions and institutional archives, one key difference from my previous roles is that I am now managing and providing access to records concerning Indigenous communities and Native tribes in North America. At my previous institutions, records by and about Native peoples were scarce. In contrast, DMNS has a long history of collecting Native American cultural objects and documenting research, largely conducted by white scholars, on Native American history. While the museum's anthropology collections unit, they house the objects, the archives holds related texts, photographs, and research papers from both museum curators and external researchers. Next slide, please. So a pivotal example is the Mary and Frances Crane collection. In the 1970s, DMNS acquired a vast collection of objects, images, and texts from the Cranes, who had attempted to start a museum in Florida about North American Indian tribes. This collection became the foundation for the Mary and Frances Crane North American Indian Cultures Hall, an exhibit that opened in 1975. Despite my museum's leadership since 1990 in NAGPRA, which is the U.S. Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the exhibit remained outdated and problematic in its portrayal of Indigenous history. After years of concerns about its representation of Indigenous experiences, the museum closed the exhibit in June of 2023. Although the exhibit hall is now closed, the cultural objects, as well as the archival materials, remain in our collections and must be responsibly stewarded. This includes collections like the Jessie Bratley images, which contains hundreds of glass plate negatives that arrived with the Crane collection, documenting young children at Native American boarding schools. And for years, our online digital collection site included about 350 images of U.S. Indian boarding school scenes and the students who were largely forced to attend and assimilate to white settlers' ways. Many of these children were abused and neglected, and some had even died. We know that these images hold trauma, yet they are some of our most requested images in our collection, because the history of Native American boarding schools is of great interest to researchers and journalists. Whether or not they should be available online is a question worth exploring, but we already decided to remove the Bratley images from our online collections portal as we determine the best course of action with input from the source communities. Ensuring culturally responsive stewardship of the Bratley images and other collections is part of the DMNS Archive's major goals over the next 5 years. And this year, we plan to take a couple of really concrete steps to attain that long-term goal. First, we are going to develop a formal statement outlining our commitment to responsible care of these materials, and we're going to incorporate best practices directly from Indigenous communities. For years, Indigenous communities have fought for greater control over archival records documenting their ancestors and histories. And a critical step forward has been the development of the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, or PNAM, which is a set of best practices for culturally responsive archival stewardship. Community members and the SAA Native American Archives section have provided workshops and guidance on implementing these protocols, which my staff and I have been fortunate to attend. And then the second thing we want to do is participate in a joint grant with the museum's anthropology department, which will fund consultations with the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes and include a review of archival materials related to their communities. So at DMNS, the anthropology department has a strong history of collaborating with Indigenous tribes, but the archives has not ever been part of these conversations, and this is something we want to change. So we hope that by receiving funding to invite community members to the museum to review both cultural objects and archival materials, and work with the community input to respectfully and adequately describe, manage, store, and provide the right level of access to these archival holdings. Of course, we wish we could do more in the next year, but we just don't have the resources. The DMNS Archives currently has 2 full-time permanent staff. We have 1 full-time temporary staff member, and then we have 2 very part-time volunteers. So sharing resources and experiences about navigating access and restrictions is something that I hope to see the SAA Museum Archive section take a more active role in, which leads me to the next part of my talk about the Museum Archive section. Next slide, please. The Museum Archive section is one of around 40 different sections within the Society of American Archivists, abbreviated SAA. It is open to all SAA members without additional fees or qualifications. Established in 1986, the section was created to bring together museum archivists to foster learning and collaboration. And today it includes approximately 700 members, primarily from art, science, and history museums, but also has individuals that are simply interested in the work of museum archivists. I currently serve as chair, a role I was elected into, and my term concludes in August. I work alongside a steering committee of 5 elected members, a vice chair, chair-elect, a secretary, web liaison, and a newsletter editor, and each position carries a 2-year term. Over the years, the Museum Archive section has actively supported its members through research, advocacy, and resource development. A major milestone came in 2011 when the section established the Standards and Best Practices Working Group. This initiative aimed to revitalize the section, address critical archival issues, and expand upon a book, a 2004 publication, Museum Archives and Introduction. The working group significantly shaped the field by hosting symposia, conducting focused research, producing essays on essential topics like born digital records, advocacy, and records management, and compiling the Museum Archives Resource Guide, which is a valuable collection of sample procedures, policies, and documents frequently used by museum archivists. All of these resources can be accessed by anyone, member or non-member, on our website through SAA, and the link is in my slides, which I hope to be able to share after this presentation. And then all of their work culminated in a 2022 publication of Museum Archives Practice Issues Advocacy, which is a comprehensive modern exploration of museum archives. This book is the 3rd published volume dedicated to museum archives in the US. The first book was published in 1984. The second was Deborah Weiss' revision, published in 2004. And then this 2022 book features 17 chapters covering key archival topics from a museum archivist perspective, such as management, access and use, records management, oral history, visual and audiovisual collections, and deaccessioning and repatriation. Building on the momentum from that book, the authors organized a 1-day museum archives symposium at Yale University's Center for British Art in May of 2024. This event brought together speakers from across the US as well as England and covered topics such as education and outreach, acquisitions, permissions and licensing, and reappraisal of collections. The symposium provided a rare opportunity for museum professionals to gather, reflect on evolving archival practices, and engage in meaningful discussions, much like this conference today. If you missed it, you can actually watch all of the sessions on YouTube for free. And I also have a link to that in my slides. And an event like that is not very likely to occur again in the US anytime soon. The museum archive section itself lacks the resources to host such a one-day symposium. However, we continue to foster collaboration and learning through other avenues. One of our most valuable tools is the museum archive section email listserv, where members seek advice and share insights. Recent discussions have tackled complex issues like retention of musical recordings, which is a really big copyright challenge here in the United States, acquiring three-dimensional artifacts, which is somewhat rare for a lot of us archivists who deal with paper and photos more frequently than objects, and managing archival records in Microsoft 365, including email appraisal and long-term storage of born digital and digitized archival records. These discussions often generate practical solutions and, at the very least, reassurance that others are facing the same struggles. Unlike the other resources that I'm sharing today, this listserv is only accessible to members. But another key initiative is our pop-up presentations, where members volunteer to give short talks on relevant topics and then followed by a Q&A. We hold 3 or 4 of these a year, and past presentations have covered processing exhibition files, disaster response, and providing online access to collection descriptions and digitized materials. These pop-ups are free. They're available to anyone who wants to register. And while typically they're only advertised through SAA channels, you do not need to be a member of SAA or the museum archive section to register. And then additionally and lastly, we publish a biannual newsletter, and we also host an annual virtual business meeting each summer. These business meetings usually feature guest speakers or a panel discussion, which is kind of like a mini symposium. Last year, we heard from 3 museum archivists on reparative description, the practice of assessing and revising outdated or problematic metadata in archival collections. And then this year, in July or August, we will be partnering with another SAA section, the Science, Technology, and Healthcare section, and we'll have speakers on the topic of incorporating archival materials in exhibitions. Through these initiatives, the Museum Archive section continues to serve as a hub for professional development, collaboration, and advocacy in the museum archives field. And links to many of the resources that I've mentioned, the newsletter, and just general information about the SAA Museum Archive section can be found on our website at that URL on my slide. Next slide, please. All right, so now that I've shared insights about my museum, myself, the SAA Museum Archive section, I want to shift focus to a broader issue, and that is the state of museum archivists in the United States. So this part of my talk would have looked very different had I given it a year ago or even just a few months ago. And while I generally prefer to keep politics out of professional discussions, the current climate in the US makes that impossible. The economy, archivists' livelihoods, and even the communication and understanding of facts and scientific information, which are core values of many museums, including my own, are under threat. The challenges facing museums are deeply connected to the challenges facing museum archives and archivists. According to a 2014 IMLS report, the US is home to over 35,000 museums, spanning a vast range of sizes, disciplines, and funding models. Government-funded museums, such as those within the Smithsonian Institution, are at particular risk. Proposed budget cuts could strip funding or even eliminate institutions entirely. There are 2 members of the Museum Archives section steering committee who work for federal museums, and they are navigating an uncertain future week by week and day by day. This instability has made it difficult to plan some section activities. Another issue is that the pandemic's impact still lingers, so attendance at many museums has yet to recover to pre-COVID levels. And combine that with an unstable economy, budgets remain stretched thin. My own museum is forecasting a flat budget for this year and had to make cuts after a budget shortfall last year. Even the museums that don't rely directly on federal funding often depend on federal grants for critical projects in preservation, access, and records management. Recent proposed funding cuts will have devastating effects. Just 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump signed an executive order to eliminate the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, one of the largest sources of funding and support for U.S. museums, libraries, and archives. And this is just one grant funding agency of several from which museums and archives have historically relied on for funding, and which are being cut. Budgets are being cut. Others include the National Endowment for the Humanities. This is the agency funding my temporary employee, who has been instrumental in helping us implement a new digital asset management system. There's the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Science Foundation, which is a huge grant funder for science museums such as mine, and the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, or NHPRC. This is the commission, the organization that funded my first job that launched my career. And this year, NHPRC suspended its archival grant projects or project grants, a decision that is affecting a lot of us who have planned to apply. All of these cuts, many of which are currently proposed but likely to happen, mean fewer opportunities to hire temporary workers and advance critical projects, especially in digital preservation and access to digital materials. Remember when I mentioned the difficult job market for archivists? Now it will be even worse. Museum archivists have long faced economic challenges, regardless of political leadership. However, the current trend to attack diversity, equity, and inclusion is compounding problems and making our work even more difficult. Next slide, please. So over the past decade, archivists in the US have worked really hard to re-examine collections, our hiring practices, and representation in archives. One particular effort is reparative description, which I mentioned before, analyzing and revising outdated or biased archival descriptions. You know, describing materials is one of the most fundamental and important things that we do as archivists. We create finding aids for public access. We document our holdings in collections management systems and create detailed descriptions for online digital collections. Archivists use existing description directly from the material, as well as descriptions created by former archivists decades ago. And this language can become outdated and be inappropriate and offensive. So archivists have made great strides to revise harmful language by using preferred terms by the communities being described and being transparent about our processes and decisions. We have also been working to expand representation by actively acquiring collections that document the histories of women, people of color, and other historically and systematically marginalized groups here in the US. And the Society of American Archivists has really worked to broaden the profession and question the traditional pathways into archives, which have long been dominated by white professionals, largely because you have to have certain privileges to move where the jobs are and take low-paying roles to continue or advance in the archives profession. So US archivists have prioritized these efforts and made many improvements, but these are not simple problems to fix, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. With the current assault on DEI at the federal level and little possibility of federal funds towards these initiatives, these efforts will be stymied. But it's not all doom and gloom. I know archivists will continue to incorporate this work into common practice and fight to communicate the value of this work because museum archivists and all archivists are resilient. We have navigated economic crises before, and we will continue to advocate for our profession to preserve historical records, and fight for inclusive representation. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? Well, I think it's important to think about affecting change in the same manner that I structured my talk, from narrow to big, or individual to profession at large. Change and progress start at an individual level. It's really easy right now to feel overwhelmed by the challenges ahead, with unstable funding, threats to diversity and inclusion, the rapid evolution of digital records. But the question that I try to ask myself daily is, what can I do today? How can I protect my profession, my livelihood, and that of my colleagues? How can I help diversify the collections we steward, ensuring they reflect a fuller, more inclusive history? How can I ensure our digital footprint remains accessible and meaningful hundreds of years from now? How can we rethink and improve how we acquire, manage, and describe archival records? And while change begins with the individual, little will endure without collaboration. The challenges that we're facing are not isolated to any one institution or even one country. The Museum Archive section of SAA has been instrumental in fostering dialogue and offering practical solutions to archivists across the United States. It's connected us, helped us navigate challenges, and provided a platform for sharing expertise. But we have to ask ourselves, where do our paths intersect with our global allies? What similar challenges are you facing in your institutions? What solutions have you found? And how can we learn from one another and share our resources to build a more resilient, connected profession? I'll admit that I hadn't heard of this conference before this year, but hearing from the afternoon sessions and speaking to you now is a step forward in answering these questions and finding collaborative solutions. These cross-border conversations are vital. So I really hope that you see me and the SAA Museum Archive sections as partners after today. So in answering my first question, what can I do? I will share our annual business meeting registration with this conference, with the conference's organizers when it's available. You might have to attend at night or before the sun rises if you want, but I think it's worth it. It certainly has been for me this morning. Next slide, please. So before I close, I just want to mention that most of the images in my presentation can be accessed in the DM&S digital collections. The website is on my slide. And I hope that you've enjoyed or found some value in this closing session. I hope that you will contact me if you have follow-up questions or to collaborate. And thank you so much. Gracias.
Moltes gràcies. Moltes gràcies des dels Estats Units, Laura Uglean. Doncs en resposta una mica potser al que vostè planteja, hem rebut una pregunta, proposta, que diu literalment això, diu: podria estar molt bé crear un grup d'experts o una secció a l'ICA sobre arxius dels museus, i més si la proposta surt dels Estats Units, que sou molts els arxius de museus implicats. Estaria molt bé i donaria un valor afegit i un suport a la professió que treballa als arxius dels museus, una xarxa internacional sobre arxius de museus.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
Suposàvem.
Yeah, how do we make that happen? I would be happy to talk to whoever proposed that and strategize.
La intenció hi és, per tant, segur que això pot arribar a bon port i fer-se materialitzar-se. Si hi ha proposta per ambdues parts. Moltes gràcies, senyora Uglean, per haver tancat avui aquesta jornada. Molt bon dia. A nosaltres ja gairebé bona tarda. Gràcies.